Before we dive into this wild ride, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? I love hearing just how far these Karen tales of chaos and karma can travel. The fridge door slammed hard enough to rattle the magnets, and the sound cut through the office like a gunshot. Brandon froze at his desk,
You stole my food
fingers
again?
hovering
How
over the
could you?
keyboard,
It was just a
already
bite.
knowing
Calm
what he was
down.
about to find before he even stood up. The hum of fluorescent lights suddenly felt louder, sharper, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He stood, walked down the short corridor, and stepped into the break room with the sinking certainty of someone arriving late to a crime scene. The refrigerator stood open, cold air spilling out uselessly, and his lunch bag sat there empty, folded in on itself like an insult. Not again. His jaw tightened as the smell of reheated leftovers and burnt coffee mixed into something sour. This wasn't an accident. It hadn't been for weeks. Brandon was 38, old enough to value routine, and young enough to still believe basic decency should be a given. He dressed sharply, spoke calmly, and kept to himself, the kind of man who earned respect without demanding it. His lunches were simple but deliberate, made early each morning before work, packed with care because they were one of the few predictable pleasures in his day. Losing them wasn't just inconvenient. It felt personal, like someone reaching into his space and daring him to react. He closed the fridge slowly, breathing through his nose, already running through the same useless questions. Who does this? Why keep doing it? And why does it keep happening to me? He didn't have to look far for the answer. Lena sat at the small round table near the microwave, chewing loudly, scrolling through her phone with one hand while the other held a familiar container. His container. She didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't even pretend to be surprised when he stopped a few feet away. Lena was around 40, impeccably styled even in an office that barely noticed such things. Her blonde hair was always neat, her clothes bold, her presence impossible to ignore. She had a voice that carried whether you wanted it to or not, and a confidence that bordered on entitlement. Everyone knew her. No one liked her, and no one challenged her. Brandon watched her for a moment, disbelief hardening into something heavier. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension that only he appeared to acknowledge. She took another bite, nodded to herself as if approving the taste, and finally glanced up at him with mild annoyance. "What?" she asked, mouth still full, as if he were the one interrupting. That single word landed harder than any insult. He wanted to say something sharp, something loud, something that would finally break the pattern, but years of professionalism anchored him in place. He turned and left the room without a word, the sound of her chewing following him like a dare. This wasn't the first time. It wasn't even the fifth. For over a month, lunches had been disappearing across the office, containers returned empty or not at all, names peeled off labels, notes ignored. At first, people joked about it, then complained quietly, then stopped bringing anything worth stealing. Brandon noticed because he paid attention. He noticed because it kept happening to him. And he noticed because the same person was always nearby when it did. Lena never denied it outright. She deflected, joked, shrugged. If pressed, she'd say food in a shared fridge was fair game, or that someone must have taken hers first. Her logic shifted depending on the day, but her behavior never did. That afternoon, Brandon tried the reasonable route. He waited until the office thinned out, then approached her desk with measured steps and an even tone. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. He explained, clearly and calmly, that his food had gone missing multiple times and that he'd seen her with it. He asked her to stop. Lena leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and smiled like someone being entertained by a child. She told him he was overreacting. She suggested he label his food better. She implied he should be flattered someone liked his cooking. When he didn't laugh, her smile faded into something sharper. "If you're so worried," she said, "maybe bring less tempting food." The conversation ended there, not because it was resolved, but because there was nowhere left for it to go. The next day, his lunch disappeared again. Frustration spread quietly through the office, an undercurrent of irritation no one addressed directly. People whispered in hallways, rolled their eyes when Lena passed, shared stories in low voices about missing snacks and half-eaten meals. No one confronted her publicly. She was too loud, too confrontational, too good at turning herself into the victim. Brandon felt the pressure building, not just from hunger or inconvenience, but from the unspoken expectation that he should let it go. Be the bigger person. Avoid drama. That expectation weighed on him more than the theft itself. He wasn't angry because he'd lost a sandwich. He was angry because someone kept crossing a line and daring him to accept it. He started paying closer attention. He noted the timing, the days she stayed late, the way she lingered near the fridge even when she wasn't heating anything. He watched her expressions when she found something she liked, the small flash of satisfaction she didn't bother hiding. Lena thrived on reaction, on attention, on the quiet power of knowing she could do something and get away with it. That was the key, Brandon realized late one evening as he sat alone at his desk, the office nearly silent. She didn't steal because she was hungry. She stole because she could. The realization didn't calm him. It focused him. He understood then that another polite conversation would change nothing. Complaining upward would turn messy and slow, and he had no interest in becoming the problem while she played innocent. Direct confrontation would only give her what she wanted. If he wanted this to stop, he'd need to approach it differently. He'd need to be smarter, quieter, strategic. The thoughts settled in his mind, equal parts unsettling and relieving. The next morning, as he packed his lunch, Brandon paused longer than usual. He looked at the empty container on the counter, then at his reflection in the dark window. He wasn't smiling, but there was something steady in his expression, a calm resolve replacing the frustration. He packed the container carefully, sealed it, and placed it in his bag. As he zipped it closed, he felt the faintest spark of anticipation. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't wondering if his lunch would be stolen. He was wondering what would happen when it was. Brandon arrived at the office earlier than usual, the building still half asleep, the parking lot quiet enough to make his footsteps echo. He liked the calm of these minutes, the sense that time belonged to him before the noise crept in. That morning, though, the calm carried a different weight. He wasn't nervous, exactly, but alert in a way he hadn't been before, as if every small sound mattered. He set his bag down, removed the lunch container, and held it for a second longer than necessary, feeling its weight, confirming its seal. Nothing about it looked unusual. That was the point. He slid it into the refrigerator among the other lunches, placed deliberately on the middle shelf, then closed the door with a quiet click and walked away without looking back. The hours that followed stretched and compressed at the same time. Brandon worked, answered emails, attended meetings, all while a part of his attention stayed fixed on the break room. He noticed who passed by, who lingered, who glanced toward the fridge longer than necessary. Lena arrived late, as she often did, her voice announcing her presence before she appeared. She laughed loudly at something on her phone, dropped her bag onto her desk, and headed straight for the coffee machine. Brandon watched from his peripheral vision, his expression neutral, his posture relaxed. If she suspected anything, she gave no sign. She never did. By late morning, the office had filled in, the usual rhythm settling over the floor. The faint smell of toast drifted from the break room, followed by the hum of the microwave. Brandon's stomach tightened, not with hunger, but with anticipation. He reminded himself to breathe, to stay grounded. Whatever happened next needed to unfold naturally. He couldn't rush it. He couldn't interfere. The plan depended on Lena being Lena. She didn't disappoint. Just before noon, Brandon heard the fridge open, then close, followed by the unmistakable scrape of plastic against plastic. Chairs shifted. Someone laughed nervously. He didn't move. He didn't look. He waited, counting his breaths, until the sounds aligned with what he'd expected. A pause. Then a sharp intake of breath. A chair scraped back abruptly, legs screeching against tile. Brandon stood, heart steady, and walked toward the break room with measured steps, as if responding to any other midday distraction. The room was full, too full to ignore what was happening. Lena stood near the table, her lunch container open in one hand, the sandwich half unwrapped, thick sauce dripping onto the surface below. For a split second, confusion flickered across her face, quickly replaced by outrage. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as she stared at what she was holding. The green shape jutting out of the bread seemed unreal, like a bad joke that hadn't landed yet. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered her name. Brandon stopped a few feet away, taking in the scene without comment. "What is this?" Lena demanded, her voice rising as she shook the sandwich slightly, sauce splattering onto the table. "What kind of sick joke is this?" Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a target, landing on Brandon with sudden certainty. She straightened, anger hardening her expression, and pointed at him with her free hand. "This is yours, isn't it?" she snapped, waving the sandwich like evidence. "You did this." The room went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, as if everyone had agreed, without speaking, to watch how this played out. Brandon didn't respond immediately. He looked at the sandwich, then at her, then at the faces around them, each one reflecting some mix of shock, curiosity, and barely concealed satisfaction. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "You took my lunch," he said. "It wasn't a question. It didn't need to be." Lena scoffed, her laugh sharp and brittle. "Don't turn this around on me," she said, raising her voice further. "You left this in the fridge. Anyone could have grabbed it. You can't just poison people and call it a prank." Her grip tightened on the sandwich, knuckles whitening, as if the object itself had betrayed her. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and absurd. Brandon felt the weight of the moment settle, felt the careful balance between escalation and control. He chose his next words carefully. "It wasn't poison," he said evenly. "It was food. My food." He gestured toward the container in her hand. "Which you've taken more than once." Murmurs rippled through the room. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Someone else nodded. Lena's confidence faltered for just a second, enough for Brandon to notice. She recovered quickly, doubling down, her voice growing louder, as if volume alone could restore control. "This is harassment," she insisted. "I should report you. This is completely inappropriate." She gestured wildly, sauce dripping onto the floor now, her composure slipping as the attention stayed fixed on her. Brandon said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence did the work for him. The longer it stretched, the more her words echoed back at her, hollow and unconvincing. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. A manager appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise, followed closely by someone from Human Resources. Their eyes took in the scene quickly, the sandwich, the crowd, Lena's flushed face, Brandon's composed stance. Questions began, measured and procedural, but the answers came unevenly. Lena spoke over them, gesturing, insisting, reframing. Brandon waited until asked, then explained simply, factually, without embellishment. He described the missing lunches, the repeated pattern, the private conversation that had gone nowhere. He didn't accuse. He didn't dramatize. He let the facts stand. As the discussion unfolded, something shifted in the room. Coworkers who had stayed silent before began to speak up, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Stories overlapped. Dates were mentioned. Names of missing items. The pattern became undeniable. Lena's protests grew more frantic, her arguments circling back on themselves, each one weaker than the last. Brandon watched her not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of inevitability. This was always how it was going to end. She had mistaken silence for permission, patience for weakness. Eventually, the manager raised a hand, calling for order. Lena was asked to step aside, to calm down, to explain herself privately. She resisted, her voice cracking with anger and disbelief, but the room no longer bent around her. As she was led away, still clutching the ruined sandwich, she turned once more toward Brandon, her glare sharp and promising. He met her gaze steadily, neither apologetic nor smug. The break room emptied slowly after that, conversations resuming in hushed tones. The energy shifted but unresolved. Brandon returned to his desk, sat down, and exhaled for the first time all day. He knew this wasn't over. He could feel it in the way the air still buzzed, in the way Lena's anger lingered like a storm cloud just out of sight. The line had been crossed, the balance tipped, but consequences took time. As he opened his email and tried to refocus, one thought stayed with him, clear and unshakable. The hardest part wasn't what he'd done. It was waiting to see what would happen next. The office felt different in the days that followed, quieter but not calmer, like a room after a storm where the air still hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Brandon noticed it immediately. Conversations stopped when he walked past, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. People glanced at him with expressions that mixed relief and awe, as if he'd done something they'd all imagined but never dared to carry out. He kept his head down, answered emails, met deadlines, and acted as though nothing had changed, even though everything had. The break room, once a casual afterthought, had become neutral ground, entered carefully and exited quickly. Lena didn't return the next day, or the one after that. Whispers filled the gaps she left behind. Some said she'd been sent home, pending review. Others claimed she was arguing with management, insisting she'd been set up. Brandon didn't ask. He didn't need to. He knew how these things worked, how consequences moved slowly but deliberately, gathering weight with every verified detail. He focused on his work, on routine, on reclaiming the small normalities that had been disrupted for weeks. When lunchtime came, he opened the fridge and found his meal exactly where he'd left it. The sight brought an unexpected tightness to his chest, a quiet satisfaction that felt earned rather than triumphant. On the fourth day, an email arrived from Human Resources requesting Brandon's presence in a conference room. The wording was neutral, procedural, but the timing told him everything he needed to know. He arrived on time, sat straight-backed at the table, and waited as the door closed behind him. The HR representative spoke first, outlining the investigation in careful terms, referencing multiple reports, corroborated accounts, and a pattern of behavior that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding. Brandon listened, nodding when appropriate, answering questions with the same calm clarity he'd maintained from the start. When asked about the incident itself, he described it plainly, emphasizing intent, preparation, and safety. There was no malice in his tone, only facts. Lena was brought in shortly after, her presence announced by the abrupt opening of the door. She looked different. The confidence that once radiated from her had thinned, replaced by a brittle defensiveness that couldn't quite hold its shape. Her clothes were still sharp, her hair still neat, but the energy had shifted. She avoided Brandon's eyes as she sat down, then launched into her explanation before being prompted, words tumbling over each other in a rush to control the narrative. She spoke of humiliation, of betrayal, of feeling targeted. When pressed about the lunches, she deflected, minimized, reframed. The more she spoke, the smaller her arguments became, until they collapsed under their own contradictions. The meeting ended without drama. There was no shouting, no final outburst, just a quiet finality that settled as decisions were communicated. Lena was placed on probation, formally reprimanded, and required to issue a written apology to those affected. New policies regarding shared spaces were announced, clear and enforceable. Brandon was thanked for his cooperation and dismissed with a nod that carried more respect than any verbal praise could have. He left the room feeling lighter, not because he'd won, but because the weight he'd been carrying was finally set down. Lena's apology arrived 2 days later. It was brief, impersonal, and carefully worded, acknowledging misunderstandings and poor judgment, without ever naming the behavior outright. Brandon read it once, then archived it. He didn't respond. He didn't need closure from her. What mattered was what followed. Lena returned to the office subdued, her movements quieter, her voice lower. She kept her distance from a break room, from Brandon, from anyone who might remind her of what she'd lost. The power she once wielded so casually had evaporated, leaving behind an awareness she'd never had to cultivate before. The office adjusted. Laughter returned to the break room, tentative at first, then freer. People brought their lunches again, labeled them less out of fear and more out of habit. Someone taped a small sign to the fridge reminding everyone to respect shared spaces. It stayed up not because it was enforced, but because it felt necessary, a symbol of a boundary that had finally been drawn. Brandon noticed the change in himself too. He stood a little straighter, spoke a little more confidently. Not because he sought recognition, but because he trusted his instincts again. Weeks passed. The incident faded into story, then into memory. New projects replaced old tensions. Deadlines loomed, meetings multiplied, and the rhythm of work reclaimed its place. Brandon settled back into routine, his mornings predictable, his lunches intact. Occasionally, he'd catch Lena watching him from across the room, her expression unreadable, a mix of resentment and something else he couldn't quite name. He didn't meet her gaze. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered, received, and absorbed. One afternoon, as Brandon packed up to leave, he paused by the break room. The fridge hummed softly, the counter clean, the space unremarkable again. He smiled to himself, a small, private gesture, and turned off the light as he left. Justice, he'd learned, didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came quietly, settled in, and stayed. And as he stepped out into the evening air, he wondered, not without irony, how many small acts of patience it took to remind someone that consequences were always closer than they seemed. As Brandon walked out of the office that evening, the noise and tension finally faded behind him, replaced by a calm he hadn't felt in weeks. The problem that once lingered over every lunch break was gone, not because of anger or force, but because accountability had finally stepped in. He didn't feel proud so much as relieved, knowing that respect had been restored in the simplest way possible. Sometimes, standing your ground doesn't mean raising your voice. It means being patient, smart, and letting the truth speak for itself. If you enjoyed this story and want more dramatic, satisfying workplace tales like this one, leave a comment with your thoughts, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.